I said we're going to put a 100% tariff on every one of those nations.
It's April 2nd, 2025, and we have finally arrived at what Donald Trump likes to call Liberation Day, the day that he says he's going to unleash a set of tariffs on countries around the world that have been charging America unfair tariffs, that have been treating America unfairly on the global economic stage. It's a set of tariffs that could have far-reaching implications for the global economy and particularly for India. India has built a very strong trading relationship with the United States over the last couple of decades, and there is significant fear around markets as well as more generally about the impact that such reciprocal tariffs that Donald Trump's administration plans to levy on India. There is fear about the kind of impact that could have on the Indian economy. Joining me now to unpack Trump's reciprocal tariffs, Liberation Day, and what all of this would mean for the Indian economy is Professor Rajat Kathuria of Shiv Nadar University. He is the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences there. Professor Kathuria, thank you so much for joining us again on India Today Global. Could you begin by walking us through what exactly is expected to happen today? What exactly are these reciprocal tariffs? Could you just explain some of the economic rationale behind this? What are we looking at here?
Thanks for having me. Yes, I mean, the reciprocal tariffs, I think the term itself is severely misleading, I think. And what Mr. Donald Trump is trying to do is match the tariffs that India charges the United States in particular tariff lines and to reciprocate the same tariffs on Indian imports in those tariff lines to the United States, Indian exports to the United States. But the whole idea of a trade regime or a trading agreement between countries, whether you look at the multilateral system or whether you look at the bilateral system, countries are at different levels of development. So you cannot expect an India and a United States to charge the same level of tariff for the same sort of broad tariff lines that one is looking at. So if we are charging them 100% import duty on automobiles, for example, in that broad category, it does not mean that the United States is justified in doing exactly the same thing. The United States is a $30 trillion economy, 6 times the size of India. And in per capita terms, it is 90 times the size of India. So I don't really understand what the meaning of this reciprocal tariffs are. We have to recognize that countries are at different levels of development and they need different trading regimes or different trading agreements with partner countries or within the multilateral system to be able to lift themselves into development or take off. And that was the whole idea of the special and differential treatment, which is embodied in the World Trade Organization or in the trade agreement at the multilateral level. So I think this term itself, reciprocal tariffs, is highly misleading. It's unjustified and iniquitous, and I think it's unfair.
Understood. Professor Kathuria, could I begin by then asking you to unpack for us what these tariffs that we're looking at could look like? Because there's been a lot of confusion. You look at some of the reporting, there's a sense that even within the White House, even within the Trump administration, there isn't a clear sense of what tariffs could look like. We're hearing on one end, 20% tariffs on all goods coming into the United States. On another end, we're hearing, no, it'll be country specific, it will be sector specific. Could you just break down this confusion? What have you been hearing or reading about what these tariffs are going to look like?
So what I'm reading out of all the reports that are coming out of the economic advisory to Donald Trump and from the White House is that, there'll be a broad level of tariffs, which is, either 10% or 20% or 25%. And then depending on how the other countries retaliate, the US will also retaliate. So the US has suggested that it's going to impose 200% retaliatory tariff on EU wines should the EU respond to some of the initial tariffs that US had imposed on EU. So I think, while one has a sense of the broad or the average level of tariffs that are going to be imposed by the United States, one doesn't have clarity on what the item-wise tariff is going to be across countries. For India, he had said 10%. For China, he had initially said 20%, and for the EU, 25%. But when you unpack them to different tariff lines and disaggregate them, then one is not clear at what the level of tariff is going to be. So, one will have to wait and watch at what is the tariff that is going to be imposed by the United States on India's exports, let's say, of automobiles, auto components, pharmaceuticals, handicrafts, gems and jewelry, diamonds. There'll obviously be different levels of tariff, and at the aggregate, you would expect that they would add up to, on an average, to 10%, which is what he has said in his statements previously.
Understood. Professor Kuzia, could you tell us a little bit about what you see as a potential impact of these tariffs? There's, again, a lot of reporting because there is uncertainty. We've seen already some of the impacts on the Indian stock market. There have been sell-offs in the last couple of days and weeks because of considerable uncertainty in the global markets. There are concerns about, as you were mentioning, the automotive sector being hit, electronics, pharmaceuticals, really mainstays of India's industrial capacity that India has tried to build up over the last couple of years. There is some talk about them being hit precisely because America has rapidly emerged as India's largest trading partner. What exactly is the outlook for the Indian industry? Is it going to be significantly impacted?
Well, of course, there's going to be an impact, and an impact at a macro level, and of course, the impact will be more severe at the sector level, and there is going to be an impact. However, as an economist who's been working on India for the last 3 or 4 decades, I think that every crisis has an opportunity, and I think this is an opportunity, as you said yourself in the introduction, that this might be an opportunity for India, which is a high tariff economy, to not only reduce the tariffs, but also to begin to introduce, genuine competition within the domestic market so that we can improve our competitiveness. And I think that is one thing that India should certainly do. And the other thing that India should certainly do is begin to diversify its export market away from the United States. Because the United States, if the last couple of months are any indication, and if one were to read the tea leaves, there's going to be huge amount of uncertainty that is likely to emanate from the United States market. And any uncertainty is bad. If we had certainty that the tariffs would be 20% on India and they would remain to 20%, then it wouldn't be as bad. But I think what adds to the problem is the volatility and the uncertainty that surrounds the US market. So for both those reasons, I think one is the high level of tariffs that are going to be imposed on India, and two, the uncertainty that is emanating from the United States market. I think for both these reasons, India should look at doing two things. One is India should look at making its domestic industry much more competitive, rather than paying lip service to the ease of doing business. I think we should get down to the business end and see what is it, not at the national level, because that's not where the production and manufacturing happens. We should go down to the state level and see what are the handicaps that industry actually faces in trying to become more competitive. So that's one thing that we should do with some amount of seriousness, and as the government says, in mission mode. That is something that we should do. And secondly, I think this is an opportunity for India to look at alternative markets. There are lots of markets that India can penetrate, including, Europe. We are looking at a free trade agreement with Europe. We are looking at a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. We are looking to deepen some other free trade agreements, and those will provide markets for Indian production. And as we become more competitive, I think we can increase our market share, even in countries where traditionally we haven't had much success in penetrating those markets. And by this, I mean not only Europe and United Kingdom, but I also mean countries like in East Asia, countries Japan, Korea, and China, and Australasia as well. So we should begin to diversify our export basket as well, because as I said, uncertainty is really bad for industry. Understood. And having said that, I think that there is talk also to mitigate some of the impacts of United States tariff impositions on India, is to try and look at a free trade agreement with the United States. And again, I say that if things were stable, even at a higher level of tariffs, if things were stable and we had a free trade agreement with the United States, then I think India could look at that seriously. For example, if United States wants India to reduce tariffs India should sort of respond by looking at reducing tariffs, but also try and then garner some reciprocal benefits from the United States, and then get into a trade agreement that would, to an extent, mitigate the impact of the tariff increase. But while that's a good idea, and a lot of people are talking about a free trade agreement with the United States, of course, the difference, as I had indicated, between India and the United States in terms of their levels of developments is so enormous. And the kinds of demands that the United States is going to put, not on tariffs, but on conditions that India has not yet been willing to negotiate in a forthright manner, is on standards. And these standards could be from competition standards, labor standards, competition policy, state-owned enterprises. They could be environment policy, procurement policy, data policy, etc. All of these sort of conditions or standards, as trade negotiators call them, will be rather difficult at this stage for India to negotiate. Of course, these can all be phased in. But even if we were to say, okay, let's get into a trade agreement with the United States and we are negotiating, what is there in the past 2 months, or even if you go back 4 years before, what is there that inspires confidence in Mr. Trump and his regime that they will not come out and say, we don't agree and we are not going to respect this agreement? The whole idea of an agreement or a treaty-based system is that countries will, of course, they will lose because they get into an agreement, but they will also gain. But if the United States continuously focuses only on the losses and not the gains it has had by joining the global system of trade, or by its engaging in bilateral trade with its partners, if it constantly, persistently, and incessantly focuses only on its costs, then what's to prevent United States to say that, I don't respect this agreement that I've signed with India, and I'm going to now impose even higher tariffs on the country. So it's like the law of the jungle. If something is not going according to my benefit or my constituency's benefit, I will get out of it because I don't see any benefit of it. That is the history of the WTO since the last 5 years, at least. Just because the United States feels that the WTO hasn't served it well, and it's a perception. Other countries may not feel that way, but the United States feels that it's not been well served by the WTO, and there may be good reasons for saying that, but that doesn't mean you pick up the cudgels and begin to fight on your own.
Understood.
It's not the law of the jungle. There is a process. The international system has put in a process, and that process is what that countries use to try and mitigate some of the harms. But one has to respect the laws, one has to respect the treaties. And if the United States doesn't do that, then why should India even bother getting into a free trade agreement?
Understood.
I mean, this is an argument I make. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try, we should try. But there is this looming uncertainty that, a year down the line or 2 years down the line, the US could say, this is not benefiting us, so we walk out of it.
Understood. And just to add to your point, Professor, of course, there is the example of the USMCA, the trade agreement that the Americans under the first Trump administration signed with Canada and with Mexico, and now, of course, seem to be slamming more tariffs on them, despite the fact that the trade agreement was done to forestall particularly exactly this eventuality. So that's where, to our viewers, where Professor Kathuria, I think, is coming from as well. But Professor, could I also ask you, you were saying something earlier in your answer about this idea that, look, India cutting its tariffs is actually a good thing, even if it comes from Trump's pressure. There has been, at least since 2018, this rising tide of protectionism in India, more and more tariffs, to the extent that some economists have argued that we're undoing a lot of the good work that we did in starting from the 1991 reforms. Also some questions about the kinds of quality control orders that India has put into place to increase protectionism. The view is that this has stifled manufacturing in a way that has really not helped the Indian economy. Could I ask you to, in a short way, explain really what we've seen in the Indian economy since 2018? Why have we turned so much more to protectionism? And just if you could expand on what you were saying about why actually the Trump threats to cut tariffs might actually be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, tariffs in general have seen a rise over the last few years. And I think the reason why sort of we've seen an increase in tariffs is that, partly it's to do with the Make in India program. Excuse me. And there was a view within the government, or within at least some of the people advisors to the government, saying that tariffs would be a way to kickstart the Make in India program. Uh, and once the Make in India kicks off and they become competitive, we can look at reducing those tariffs and using, tariffs, just like the infant industry argument was used in the past, using tariffs as a method to sort of increasing domestic production or domestic value added. We know that, economists know that that's not the best way, that's not the optimal way. It's a lazy way, it's a quick way, but it's not the optimal way to engender competitiveness in your local industry, in local manufacturing. And I think that's not the right way that India should do. And therefore, I think a lot of economists, a lot of commentators has been saying, while we don't like what Mr. Trump is doing, there may be some benefits for India in this, which is that to make India a low tariff economy. And what that means really for domestic industry is that once tariffs are reduced, there's going to be more competition, not only from the domestic industry, but there's going to be more competition from abroad. And I think that is what India needs. It needs a dose of competition, while it sort of also simultaneously, as I was saying in my answer earlier, tries to reduce the handicaps that encumber Indian industry. Not for a moment am I saying that Indian industry cannot be competitive. Of course, it can be competitive. And we've shown that in certain areas that we can be world leaders or we can be global beaters. But, Indian industry does suffer handicaps, whether it's regulatory bottlenecks, whether it's logistics cost. One can go into the details, and there's been so many studies. But, simultaneously, we should do that and not use tariffs as the measure to offset some of those local disadvantages. We should target the local disadvantages directly rather than using tariffs as a method of protectionism. It's, as I said, it's a lazy way to provide incentives to domestic industry. And therefore, you then cannot expect to become a China, for example. That's, of course, China is many, many years ahead of us in terms of manufacturing. It's still the manufacturing factory of the world, and it will continue to remain so, despite a lot of talk about reshoring, friendshoring, etc. China will remain because it is very, very competitive. And even if its labor costs are going up, China continues to be the largest trading partner for over 100 countries in the world. That itself is a reflection of its competitiveness. So I think in order to get there, India has to not only become more competitive, but it has to find the right instruments to become more competitive. And I think one of the right instruments to make India more competitive is to reduce tariffs. Of course, other instruments are open up your economy to foreign direct investment, invite foreign direct investment, provide them with an environment of doing business or ease of doing business. And that's the way China did it. China's rise in manufacturing is not the result of local manufacturing. The rise of China is partnership with FDI. It's FDI that came in and provided the technology, it provided the wherewithal, it provided the skills and the manufacturing, etc., in China to reach where it is today. It has taken them 40 years, but they've done it. And there are no shortcuts in doing that. It's not going to drop into India like manna from heaven and lo and behold, we become competitive. We'll have to go through the grind in manufacturing. We'll have to do the hard work. But I think a good way to start, a good place to start, is begin to reduce the tariffs that we have so that industry can respond to those intensive incentives of more competition that is not only going to be there from within India, but especially competition that they're going to see from foreign imports.
Understood. Professor Kathuria, my last question to you is this increasing concern that you're seeing from various corners of the global economy about the possibility that Donald Trump's tariffs will, in some cases, particularly, let's say, the European Union, will lead to a retaliation from other very, very powerful economic blocs. We've seen China retaliate against American tariffs. The European Union has made clear that it will retaliate. Canada has prepared a package of economic retaliation against the United States. And there is a sense that if this continues and there is a retaliation to Donald Trump's reciprocal tariff package, then you're going to be in a situation where, in fact, the possibility of a major global economic slowdown becomes more and more real, and perhaps even a global economic recession in many key economies. Do you think that's a realistic fear? Is that something we really need to be watching out for?
Of course, of course. It's like once you've gone down this route, somebody has to back off. If you're going down the route of tariffs, retaliation, counter tariffs, counter retaliation, this is a slippery slope, and you can quickly end up not only in a recession, but you could quickly end up in the Great Depression. We are all too familiar with what economists call beggar thy neighbor policies. And beggar thy neighbor policies are simply trying to divert the demand of other countries towards your goods. And therefore, saying, why should I allow that to happen? I shall also increase tariffs so that, I can continue to generate demand for my goods, at least within the country. So, we are familiar with beggar thy neighbor policies. We are familiar with retaliatory tariffs and counter tariffs, and this could quickly sink us into the Great Depression. Somebody has to back off, and it'll need a statesman-like institution or a country or a statesman-like, initiative on somebody's part to try and drive sense into what is happening in the economic system in the world today. I mean, we are no longer in a regime where countries can be self-sufficient. No country is an island. No man is an island anymore. We are all dependent. As I was saying, if the United States feels unfairly treated, it should look at how other countries also feel. You can't simply, just because you're the most powerful economy, your privileges or your harms shouldn't be privileged over the others. India faces harms in. One keeps saying that India imposes agricultural tariffs. Look at the subsidies that the United States continues to give its agricultural farmers. They're enormous, and it is completely justified that India should also feel that is unjust treatment to agriculture that is allowed in the system and not allowed to India. So different countries, I'm giving examples of India, but different countries would feel harmed in different ways, and therefore this cycle of tariffs and counter tariffs would play out, and somebody will have to back off. What will that incentive or instrument of backing off be? Will it be the Great Depression, a replica of the Great Depression that will cause countries to back off and come together? Will it be an economic crisis like the financial crisis that we had in 2008, where all countries came together and the G20 became active once again, where countries became active? And I see that is a possibility that cannot be ruled out. If this countermeasures continue, then we are seeing that the world will be enveloped by a drag on the economy. Perhaps, certainly a recession would also become deeper. And if it becomes deeper, then countries will have to come together like they did during 2008 and try and solve the problems collectively, because it will not have individual solutions. Then it will have to be a collective effort to get out of the morass that we are creating. But it will be best to stop now rather than go down that slippery slope that we seem to be in at the moment.
Understood, Professor Kathuria. Better to stop now, but it seems, of course, that later today we'll have a much better sense of Donald Trump and what tariff actions he has planned. Thank you so much for sitting down with us, explaining to us what exactly these tariffs will mean for India, what they'll mean for the world, and also perhaps the significant negative consequences they could have for the global economy. Thank you again, Professor Kathuria, for your time. And thank you so much to our viewers for joining us here on India Today Global.